The rifle's weight had become an extension of her arms during the 3 hours. Mara Zimmerman crouched behind the boulder formation, watching dust clouds rise from the valley, below where 27 riders approached the narrow mountain pass, with intentions she knew would leave blood on the rocks before sunset. She pressed her cheek against the Winchester's stock, calculating distances and trajectories, while her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The pass behind her led to Kingston, Nevada, where 73 souls lived their ordinary lives completely unaware that the Cassidy gang planned to ride through and take everything they had worked their entire lives to build. Mara adjusted her position slightly, feeling the rough stone scrape against her worn cotton shirt as she repositioned the rifle barrel. The September afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky terrain, turning the landscape into shimmering waves of heat that distorted the horizon line. She had discovered the gang's plans purely by accident 2 days earlier, when she had been tracking a wounded deer through the foothills, and overheard their campfire conversation about hitting Kingston while the marshal was 3 towns away, testifying at a territorial trial. The decision to ride up here alone had been instinctive, born from 8 years of survival after her parents died during the cholera outbreak of 1875, leaving her at 18 to manage their small ranch alone. The riders drew closer, their voices carrying up through the pass now as they laughed and joked about easy pickings. Mara counted them again, her stomach twisting with the acknowledgement that 27 against 1 represented odds that no rational person would accept. But rationality had fled her mind the moment she thought about Mrs. Henderson's general store being ransacked, about old Thomas Wright being hurt when he inevitably tried to defend his livery, about the children who played in the streets without understanding that evil sometimes rode into peaceful places on horseback. She chambered around, the metallic click sounding impossibly loud in her ears despite the wind whistling through the rocks. Her hands remained steady even as her mind screamed that this constituted pure foolishness. The pass narrowed considerably about 300 yards ahead of her position, creating a natural bottleneck where the trail squeezed between 2 massive rock walls that rose 70 feet on either side. If she could convince them the pass was defended by multiple shooters, they might turn back and seek easier targets elsewhere. The first shot she fired struck the ground 15 feet in front of the lead rider, sending up a spray of dirt and small stones that caused his horse to rear dramatically. The animal's frightened whinny echoed off the canyon walls as Mara quickly chambered another round and fired again, this time aiming for the opposite side of the trail to create the illusion of crossfire. The riders scattered, shouting confusion and anger as they tried to locate their attackers. "The pass is defended," Mara shouted, pitching her voice as deep as she could manage. "Turn back or the next shots find flesh instead of dirt." A massive man on a gray stallion pushed forward, his weathered face twisted with fury. "Like hell we will. Boys, spread out and find them. Can't be more than 3 or 4 defenders up there." Mara fired again, this time deliberately close enough to the gray stallion that she saw the bullet kick up dirt directly beneath its hooves. The horse danced sideways nervously, but the rider maintained control with practiced ease. Her heart sank as she realized these men were not easily frightened travelers, but hardened criminals who had likely faced worse odds before, and prevailed through sheer, vicious determination. The outlaws began advancing more cautiously now, using whatever cover the terrain provided as they moved forward in a coordinated pattern that spoke of military training, or at least extensive combat experience. Mara shifted positions behind the boulder, knowing she had perhaps minutes before they flanked her location, and discovered the terrible truth that only one woman with one rifle stood between them and Kingston. She fired 3 more times in quick succession, forcing several riders to dive for cover and buying herself precious seconds. The Winchester grew hot in her hands as she worked the lever action, ejecting spent cartridges that clinked against the rocks around her feet. Sweat ran down her face, stinging her eyes and blurring her vision as the afternoon heat combined with fear-driven adrenaline to make her entire body feel like it burned from within. A bullet struck the boulder inches from her head, showering her with rock fragments that cut her cheek and drew blood. Mara flinched but maintained her position, knowing that abandoning the high ground meant certain death or capture, neither option acceptable. She returned fire toward the muzzle flash she had spotted among the scrub brush below, unsure if she hit anything but satisfied when she saw movement retreat behind a larger rock formation. The sound of hoofbeats approaching from behind made her spin around, rifle swinging to target this new threat. A single rider thundered up the narrow trail toward her position, bent low over his horse's neck, as the animal navigated the treacherous rocky path with impressive agility. Mara's finger tightened on the trigger before she registered the absence of hostile intent in the rider's posture, and the fact he approached from the direction of Kingston, rather than from the valley below. The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion while his horse was still moving, hitting the ground running and diving behind the boulder formation, just as 3 bullets struck the rocks where he had been standing seconds earlier. He landed beside Mara in a controlled roll, his own rifle already coming up to firing position as he assessed the tactical situation with experienced eyes. "Figured you could use some help," he said calmly, as though joining a desperate defensive stand against overwhelming odds was something he did every Tuesday afternoon. His voice carried a gentle drawl that marked him as born somewhere in Texas or perhaps Oklahoma, and when his eyes met hers for a brief second, Mara found herself staring into the clearest blue she had ever seen. "There are 27 of them," Mara said, surprised her voice came out steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "The Cassidy gang heading for Kingston. I have maybe 30 rounds left." "Then we best make them count," the cowboy replied, firing 3 quick shots that forced several advancing outlaws back into cover. "Name is Trent Xavier. Been tracking this gang for 6 weeks across 3 territories. Lost their trail 2 days back. Figured they were heading this direction when I heard about the marshal being gone from Kingston." Mara fired twice more before responding. "Mara Zimmerman. I have a ranch about 5 miles from town. Overheard them planning the raid and couldn't just let it happen." Trent glanced at her with something that looked remarkably like admiration before turning his attention back to the advancing outlaws. "That took considerable courage. Also considerable foolishness, but mostly courage." "The foolishness part is becoming increasingly apparent," Mara admitted, chambering another round as bullets continued striking the rocks around their position with alarming frequency. "What brings a tracker this far into Nevada territory?" "Cassidy murdered a family outside Amarillo 5 months back," Trent said flatly, his jaw tightening with barely controlled anger. "Woman and her 3 children while her husband was out working the cattle. Shot them for sport and burned the house down around them. Been hunting him ever since." The raw pain in his voice told Mara there was more to the story, some personal connection that drove him across hundreds of miles in pursuit of justice. She wanted to ask, but the immediate situation demanded her full attention as the outlaws began another coordinated advance, this time with covering fire from multiple positions that forced both defenders to press tightly against the boulder. "We cannot hold this position much longer," Mara said, stating the obvious truth neither wanted to acknowledge. They will flank us within minutes. Trent studied the terrain with a tactical eye, his gaze sweeping across the rocky landscape before settling on a narrow crevice about 40 yards to their right that led up into higher rock formations. See that gap in the rocks? We move there, we get better elevation and a more defensible position. But we have to move fast and together. On 3, Mara agreed, checking her ammunition and finding only 18 rounds remaining. She had brought everything she owned, and it was proving desperately inadequate. Trent counted down, then both of them broke from cover simultaneously, running in a crouched sprint across the exposed ground while bullets whined past them like angry hornets. Mara felt one tug at her sleeve, heard another strike the ground so close to her foot that she felt the impact through her boot. But somehow they both reached the crevice unscathed and scrambled up into the higher position. The new location provided a commanding view of the entire pass, and Trent immediately began using it to devastating effect, his rifle cracking with metronomic precision as he forced the outlaws back down the trail. Mara joined him, and together they created enough firepower to give the impression of a much larger defensive force. "Cassidy," Trent suddenly called out, his voice carrying across the rocky terrain. "I know you are down there. This is Trent Xavier. You remember that name." "You should, because I have been following you since Amarillo. Since you murdered Sarah, Thomas, Emily, and little Michael Hayes in cold blood." Silence fell across the pass as the shooting stopped abruptly. After several long seconds, a voice responded from the valley below, gravelly and thick with malicious amusement. "Xavier. That was the Hayes woman's maiden name. You her brother. Her cousin maybe, her husband's best friend," Trent replied, his voice tight with controlled fury. "James Hayes asked me to look after his family while he drove the cattle to market. I was 2 miles away checking fence line when you rode up to his door. I saw the smoke, got there just in time to watch you ride away laughing." "Well now, that is unfortunate timing," Cassidy called back mockingly. "Tell you what, Xavier. You and whoever else is up there with you ride out now. We forget this ever happened. We got business in Kingston that does not concern you." "Everything you do concerns me now," Trent shouted back. "And Kingston is off limits. Turn around and ride out, or we keep shooting until none of you can ride anywhere ever again." Cassidy's laughter echoed off the canyon walls, cruel and cold. "Big talk for maybe 3 or 4 guns. We got all day to wait you out, and when dark comes, we will climb up there and finish this personal-like." Mara leaned close to Trent, her shoulder brushing against his as she spoke quietly. "He is right about nightfall. We cannot defend this position in the dark." "I know," Trent admitted, frustration clear in his voice. "But if we can hold until sunset, that gives us maybe 5 hours, enough time for someone in Kingston to notice the shooting and hopefully send help." "Kingston is 8 miles away through winding mountain trails," Mara said doubtfully. "Even if they heard the shots, by the time help arrived we would be long dead." Trent studied her face for a long moment, really looking at her for the first time despite the desperate circumstances. "Then we make those 5 hours count. And Mara, I am genuinely glad I am not dying alone up here today." "We are not dying at all," Mara said with more conviction than she felt. "I refuse to let these men win." They settled into a defensive rhythm, conserving ammunition, and taking only shots they felt confident would hit targets or force the outlaws into cover. The afternoon dragged on with agonizing slowness, each minute feeling like an hour as the sun crawled across the sky. Mara learned during the brief pauses in shooting that Trent had grown up on a ranch outside Austin, that he had served as a territorial ranger for 3 years before resigning to pursue Cassidy. that he was 26 years old and had never married because the woman he had been courting decided ranch life was too harsh and moved back east with a banker. In turn, she shared her own story, how her parents had built their small ranch from nothing, how the cholera outbreak had taken them within days of each other, how she had learned to shoot from her father, who believed women needed to protect themselves on the frontier. She told him about the loneliness of running a ranch alone, about the townspeople who respected her independence but kept their distance because she refused to conform to their expectations of what a proper young woman should be. "You ever think about selling the ranch, moving somewhere easier?" Trent asked during a lull in the fighting. "Every single day," Mara admitted, "but it is all I have left of them, the only thing that proves they existed and mattered. I cannot just abandon that." "I understand," Trent said quietly. After Sarah and her children died, James Hayes told me he wished he had never left them alone. Said he would sell everything and move back east where it was safe. I told him that running from tragedy does not heal it, just postpones dealing with the pain. A bullet struck near their position, ending the conversation and forcing them back into combat. The outlaws had grown bolder as the afternoon wore on, advancing incrementally up the pass in a coordinated movement that spoke of Cassidy's leadership and tactical knowledge. Mara's ammunition dwindled to 12 rounds, then 8, then 5, each shot becoming increasingly precious. Trent was down to his last dozen rounds when the shooting suddenly ceased again. They waited tensely, wondering what new strategy Cassidy had devised. After several minutes of eerie silence, movement drew their attention to the valley floor where a white cloth attached to a rifle barrel waved from behind a rock formation. "Xavier," Cassidy called out, "let us talk terms. No sense in all of us dying up here today." "What terms?" Trent responded cautiously. "You got sand, I will give you that. And whoever is up there with you can shoot. We lost 4 men today, got 3 more wounded. That is more than Kingston is worth to me, so here is my offer. We ride away now, forget about Kingston, and you let us go." "Everyone lives, everyone walks away." Mara looked at Trent questioningly, but he shook his head firmly. "You murdered a family in cold blood, Cassidy. You think I am just going to let you ride off to do the same thing in the next town?" "Then we got ourselves an impasse," Cassidy replied. "And when night falls, we are coming up there. Maybe we lose a few more men in the dark, but eventually we get you. Then we go to Kingston anyway, and maybe we make them pay extra for the trouble you caused us today." Trent's jaw clenched with frustration and helpless anger. Mara touched his arm gently, drawing his attention. "What if we offered him something else?" "Like what?" "We have nothing to bargain with. Information," Mara said thoughtfully. "I heard them talking at their camp. They mentioned hitting Kingston because there was a bank shipment arriving tomorrow. $20,000 in gold coins for the mining operations north of here. What if we told them the shipment was rerouted?" "That is a lie, though," Trent pointed out. "They do not know that, and it buys Kingston time to prepare defenses once we get down from this mountain." Trent considered the idea, then nodded slowly. "Worth trying. Cassidy," he called out, "what if I told you the bank shipment you are after got rerouted 3 days ago, went to Virginia City instead because of Indian trouble on the northern route?" Silence greeted this announcement. After a long pause, Cassidy responded with evident suspicion. "How would you know about bank shipments?" "Because I was in the Kingston Marshal's office when the telegram arrived," Trent lied smoothly. "Why do you think I rode up here?" "Figured if you were stupid enough to hit a town over money that was not even there, I could finally catch up to you." More silence, punctuated by the sound of heated discussion among the outlaws below. Mara held her breath, praying the desperate bluff would work. After what felt like an eternity, Cassidy responded with barely controlled fury evident in every word. "If you are lying, Xavier, I will burn Kingston to the ground out of pure spite. Go to Virginia City yourself if you do not believe me," Trent challenged. "Ask around about the shipment. You will find I am telling the truth." Another long pause followed. Then the sound of horses moving, leather creaking, men mounting up. Mara dared to peek around the rock formation and saw the outlaws retreating down the pass, Cassidy at their head with his gray stallion. They moved slowly, weapons ready, clearly expecting treachery, but they were definitely leaving. "They are going," Mara whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "Not far enough yet," Trent cautioned, keeping his rifle trained on the retreating figures. "Stay ready." They watched until the outlaws disappeared around a bend in the valley floor, the dust cloud from their horses, hooves gradually dissipating in the late afternoon air. Even then, Trent insisted they wait another 30 minutes before abandoning their defensive position, unwilling to trust that Cassidy would not circle back for a surprise attack. When they finally climbed down from the rocks, Mara's legs nearly buckled beneath her as the accumulated tension and exhaustion of the past 4 hours hit all at once. Trent caught her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness for a man who had just spent an afternoon engaged in deadly combat. "Easy now," he said softly. "You did extraordinary work today, Mara Zimmerman. Saved a lot of lives." "We did," Mara corrected, looking up into those startling blue eyes. "I would be dead 10 times over if you had not climbed up here to stand beside me." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. They had faced death together, fought side by side against impossible odds, and emerged victorious through a combination of skill, determination, and desperate improvisation. That sort of shared experience created bonds that could not be easily explained or dismissed. "We should get to Kingston," Trent said reluctantly, though he made no move to release her elbow. "Warn them about Cassidy in case he decides to come back." They retrieved Trent's horse from where it had wandered off during the fighting, and Mara was surprised when he insisted she ride while he walked alongside. The journey to Kingston took nearly 2 hours as the mountain trail required careful navigation in the fading light. They talked continuously, conversation flowing naturally as they discovered shared views on everything from politics to literature to the best way to break a stubborn horse. Kingston appeared as the sun touched the horizon, its buildings painted gold and orange by the dying light. The town looked peaceful and utterly unaware of how close it had come to disaster. They went directly to the marshal's office, only to find it locked with a sign indicating Deputy Pierce was making evening rounds. "Try the saloon," suggested an older woman sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store. "Deputy usually stops there around this time." They found Deputy Pierce sitting at a corner table nursing a beer and looking thoroughly bored with his temporary responsibilities. His eyes widened considerably when Trent and Mara walked in wearing torn, dusty clothes with gun smoke stains and looking like they had survived a small war. "What in blazes happened to you two?" Pierce demanded, standing quickly enough to knock his chair backward. Trent explained the situation concisely, detailing the Cassidy gang's plans and the defensive action at the mountain pass. Pierce's face went through several shades of pale as he realized how close Kingston had come to being raided by one of the territory's most vicious outlaw gangs. "We need to organize defenses," Pierce said immediately. "Get volunteers armed and positioned around town perimeter in case they come back." "They will not come back tonight," Trent said with certainty. "They lost too many men and think the bank shipment is not here. But they might return in a few days once they realize I lied about Virginia City." Then we have time to prepare, Pierce agreed. I will send telegrams to the marshal and request assistance from the territorial rangers. Meanwhile, you two look like you need food, medical attention, and rest in that order. Mara realized she was indeed starving, having eaten nothing since early morning, and her body ached from hours of maintaining tense defensive positions. Trent looked equally exhausted, though he hid it well behind his calm exterior. Deputy Pierce insisted on taking them to the doctor first, where a crusty old physician named Henderson cleaned and bandaged the cut on Mara's cheek and treated several scrapes and bruises both of them had accumulated. Then Pierce practically dragged them to the boarding house where Mrs. Sullivan fussed over them while preparing a substantial meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie. "You saved our town," Mrs. Sullivan declared, setting enormous portions in front of them. "Eat. You both look half-starved." Mara discovered she was too tired to eat much despite her hunger, managing only half the stew before her eyelids began drooping uncontrollably. Trent noticed her exhaustion and stood immediately. "Mrs. Sullivan, Miss Zimmerman needs a room for the night." Of course," the boarding house owner agreed, already moving toward the stairs. "Got a lovely room on the second floor. You come along, dear." Mara wanted to protest that she needed to get back to her ranch, check on her animals, attend to 100 pressing tasks, but her body simply would not cooperate. She followed Mrs. Sullivan up the stairs in a daze, vaguely aware of Trent's concerned gaze following her. She collapsed onto the bed fully clothed and knew nothing more until sunlight streaming through the window woke her 11 hours later. For several confused seconds, Mara could not remember where she was or why her body ached like she had been trampled by horses. Then memory flooded back and she sat up quickly, wincing at the protest from stiff muscles. Someone had removed her boots while she slept and covered her with a quilt. A basin of water sat on the washstand with a clean towel beside it, and Mara used them gratefully to wash away the dried sweat and gun smoke residue from her face and hands. She desperately needed a full bath and change of clothes, but those luxuries would have to wait until she returned to her ranch. Downstairs, she found Mrs. Sullivan preparing breakfast and humming cheerfully. "There you are, dear. Sit yourself down and eat something proper. That cowboy friend of yours has been up since dawn helping Deputy Pierce organize the town defenses. Man is a force of nature when he puts his mind to something." Mara ate scrambled eggs and bacon while Mrs. Sullivan chattered about the town's preparations, how volunteers were taking shifts watching the approaches, how messages had been sent to neighboring communities requesting assistance. Through the window, Mara could see men constructing barricades at key intersections and others practicing with rifles. They clearly had not fired in years. She found Trent near the marshal's office, directing a group of men in fortifying the building's windows with heavy shutters and sandbags. He looked up as she approached, and the smile that crossed his face sent unexpected warmth through her chest. "You look better," he observed. "Sleep helped." 11 hours of it, apparently," Mara replied. "I need to get back to my ranch, check on things there. But I wanted to thank you first for everything yesterday." "Walk with me?" Trent asked, stepping away from the work crew. They strolled toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land and distant mountains. "I have been thinking about what comes next." "The marshal returns in 3 days," Mara said. "Cassidy will probably realize the Virginia City story was false by then and might double back. But with defenses prepared and help coming, Kingston should be safe." "That is not what I meant," Trent said quietly. He stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "I have been tracking Cassidy for months. Hunting him consumed everything, became my entire reason for existing. But yesterday, standing on that mountain pass beside you, fighting for something instead of just against something. I remembered what it felt like to be alive instead of just surviving. Mara's heart began beating faster as she recognized the look in his eyes, the same awareness she had been trying to ignore since the moment he dove behind that boulder to stand beside her. "Trent, I know we just met," he continued, words coming faster now as though he feared losing courage if he slowed down. "I know this seems sudden and probably foolish. But when you face death with someone, when you trust them with your life, and they trust you with theirs, you learn more about their character in hours than most people learn in years. And everything I learned about you yesterday, Mara Zimmerman, made me want to learn more." "I want that too," Mara admitted, the words escaping before she could question their wisdom. "But wanting and having are different things. You are hunting Cassidy, I have a ranch to run. Our lives do not exactly align." "They could," Trent said earnestly. "After Cassidy is caught or killed, I have nothing calling me elsewhere. No family waiting, no job to return to, no home except whatever saddle I am sleeping beside. And you said your ranch is more work than one person can properly manage. Are you proposing we run a ranch together?" Mara asked, trying to keep her tone light despite the way hope was blossoming dangerously in her chest. "Eventually, maybe I am proposing more than that," Trent said seriously. "But for now, yes. Let me help you with the ranch while I finish dealing with Cassidy. Let us see where this goes, what it might become." Mara studied his face, searching for any hint of insincerity or ulterior motive. She found only honest hope mixed with vulnerability that probably cost him considerably to show. "My ranch is small, barely profitable most years. I live simply, work hard, and have few luxuries." "I grew up on a ranch," Trent reminded her. "I know the work and I am not afraid of it. Besides, seems to me that ranch kept you alive and strong enough to hold a mountain pass alone against 27 outlaws. That speaks well of what you have built there." "Why me?" Mara asked bluntly. "You could court any woman in any town, someone softer, prettier, more refined." Trent stepped closer, near enough that she could see the individual shades of blue in his eyes. "Because you are brave and strong and smart. Because when faced with impossible odds, you chose to fight anyway. Because you care more about protecting strangers than your own safety. And because when I look at you, I see someone worth building a life beside instead of just passing time with." Mara felt tears prickling her eyes, surprised by the raw emotion his words evoked. "I have been alone for 8 years. I got used to it, learned to prefer it. I am not sure I remember how to let someone else in." "Then we figure it out together," Trent said gently. "One day at a time, no expectations beyond what feels right. If it does not work, we part as friends and you lose nothing but a ranch hand's work for however long I stay. But if it does work, maybe we both gain something worth more than all the gold in Kingston's bank." She should refuse. The sensible part of her mind knew that inviting a man she barely knew to her isolated ranch constituted dangerous foolishness. But the same sensible part would have told her yesterday that defending a mountain pass alone was equally foolish, and she had done that anyway because some things mattered more than safety. 1 month, Mara said decisively. "Work on the ranch for 1 month. If at the end of that time either of us wants to end the arrangement, no questions asked and no hard feelings." Relief and joy spread across Trent's face like sunrise. 1 month. That is fair and more than generous. When do we start? "Now, if you can spare the time from organizing Kingston's defenses." "Deputy Pierce has things well in hand," Trent assured her. "Let me get my gear." They rode out to Mara's ranch together, with her on a borrowed horse that Deputy Pierce arranged and Trent on his own mount. The 5-mile journey felt different than Mara remembered. less isolated somehow with another rider beside her. They talked continuously, discussing ranch management, sharing stories from their pasts, debating everything from religious philosophy to whether chickens were worth the trouble they caused. The ranch appeared around a bend in the trail, small and weathered but solid. 160 acres of decent grazing land, a sturdy house her father had built with his own hands, a barn that desperately needed repairs, corrals that held 23 cattle and 4 horses. Not much compared to the massive operations in Texas or Montana, but it was hers and had been earned through backbreaking labor and stubborn determination. Trent surveyed the property with an experienced eye, dismounting to examine the barn's foundation and the condition of the fencing. "Good bones," he announced. "Needs work, but the core infrastructure is sound. Your father knew what he was doing when he chose this location." "Water rights were the key," Mara explained, showing him the creek that ran through the property's northwest corner. "That creek never goes dry, even in the worst drought years. Makes all the difference for the cattle." They spent the rest of the day working together, with Mara showing Trent the various tasks and systems she had developed for managing the ranch alone. He proved to be an efficient worker who needed minimal instruction, his ranching background evident in how he handled the animals and assessed what needed doing. By sunset, they had accomplished more than Mara typically managed in 2 full days alone. Over a simple dinner of salt pork and beans, they continued talking, the conversation flowing naturally in a way that felt both comfortable and exhilarating. Trent insisted on sleeping in the barn rather than impose on her hospitality by staying in the house, a gesture of respect that Mara appreciated even as part of her wanted to protest the unnecessary propriety. The next 3 weeks fell into a rhythm that felt like it had always existed. They woke at dawn and worked until dusk, repairing fences, tending cattle, fixing the barn's roof, and completing dozens of tasks Mara had been putting off for years because they required 2 people. During meals and evening hours, they talked about everything and nothing, discovering shared views on some topics and entertaining disagreements on others. Mara caught herself watching Trent when he worked, admiring the efficient competence with which he approached every task and the gentle patience he showed with animals. Several times she looked up to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart race and her cheeks flush. On the 15th day, Cassidy and what remained of his gang returned to the Kingston area. A rancher spotted them camped in the foothills and got word to Deputy Pierce, who immediately organized a posse. Trent wanted to join them, but Mara pointed out that 30 armed townsmen could handle 8 outlaws more safely than risking himself for personal revenge. "James Hayes deserves justice," Trent said, staring toward town with visible frustration. "I promised him." "And you delivered it by saving Kingston and making sure Cassidy finally faced consequences," Mara countered. "Going yourself does not change the outcome, just risks you dying before seeing him caught." Trent struggled visibly with the logic before finally nodding. "You are right. But if they fail, if he escapes, I am going after him." The posse returned 2 days later with all 8 outlaws in chains and only minor injuries among the townsmen. Cassidy had been shot in the leg during the capture and faced hanging once the circuit judge arrived. Trent rode to town immediately upon hearing the news, and Mara went with him. Standing outside the jail, looking through the bars at the man who had consumed months of his life, Trent appeared almost disappointed. "He looks smaller than I expected, more pathetic." "Evil often does when it is finally caught and chained," Mara observed quietly. Cassidy looked up at Trent's voice, recognition dawning in his cruel eyes. "Xavier, come to gloat. Come to see justice done," Trent corrected coldly. For Sarah Hayes and her children. For every person you hurt in your miserable life. Righteous speech from a man who let a woman fight his battle for him, Cassidy sneered. Heard about the mountain pass, about how you hid behind some female's skirts while she did the real shooting. Mara stepped forward before Trent could respond, her voice cutting. He climbed that mountain knowing he might die there. Stood beside me when he could have stayed safe. That takes more courage than anything you have done in your entire wasted life. Oh, the woman speaks, Cassidy mocked. Tell me, sweetheart, how long before your cowboy there gets bored playing ranch hand and moves on? Men like him do not settle down with plain frontier women. They want excitement, danger, something more than 160 acres and a broken-down barn. Enough, Deputy Pierce interrupted, stepping between them and the cell. He is just trying to get under your skin. Do not give him the satisfaction. Outside, Trent leaned against the hitching post and took several deep breaths. He is wrong, you know, about everything. I know, Mara said, though part of her wondered if Cassidy had simply voiced doubts she had been suppressing for weeks. Come on, let us go home. The word slipped out naturally, and she saw Trent's expression transform when he registered it. Home. Not her ranch or the property, but home. A place that belonged to both of them now in ways that had nothing to do with legal ownership. They rode back in comfortable silence, the kind that only existed between people secure enough in their connection that words became unnecessary. At the ranch, Trent finally moved his belongings from the barn into the house's spare bedroom, acknowledging what they both knew was happening between them. The circuit judge arrived in Kingston 2 weeks later and conducted a trial that lasted barely 4 hours before sentencing Cassidy to hang. Trent attended the execution, standing silent among the crowd as justice was finally delivered. That night, he returned to the ranch looking both relieved and somehow emptier, as though the driving purpose that had sustained him for months had been suddenly removed. Mara found him sitting on the porch steps, staring at stars scattered across the dark sky like diamond chips on black velvet. She sat beside him without speaking, her shoulder pressing against his in silent solidarity. I thought I would feel different, Trent said eventually. Vindicated, satisfied, something. Instead, I just feel tired. Revenge does not heal wounds, Mara said gently. It just cauterizes them so they stop bleeding. Real healing takes longer and requires different medicine. What kind of medicine? Trent asked, turning to look at her directly. Time. Purpose. Building something new instead of tearing down something old. She paused, then added quietly, love, if you are lucky enough to find it. Trent reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and cupped her face gently in his calloused hand. I think maybe I am that lucky. If you feel the same way. I do, Mara whispered, her heart hammering so hard she felt certain he must hear it. I have for weeks now, but was too afraid to say anything. He kissed her then, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as she responded with equal passion. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Trent rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, Mara Zimmerman. Make this official and permanent. Let me spend the rest of my life building something good beside you. Yes, Mara said without hesitation, joy flooding through her so intensely that tears spilled down her cheeks. Yes to all of it. They married 3 weeks later in Kingston's small church, with the entire town attending to celebrate the couple who had saved them from Cassidy's gang. Mrs. Sullivan cried throughout the ceremony, and Deputy Pierce served as Trent's best man, despite knowing him only a few months. Mara wore a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit her taller frame, and carried wildflowers that Trent had spent the morning gathering from the meadow behind the ranch. The years that followed proved both challenging and deeply satisfying in ways Mara had never imagined possible. Trent's presence transformed the ranch from a struggling operation into a thriving concern. They expanded the herd, improved the buildings, and eventually purchased an adjoining property when it became available. The work remained hard, but shared labor somehow felt lighter than the same tasks performed alone. Their first child, a daughter they named Sarah Emily after the Hayes children Trent had never been able to save, arrived 2 years after their wedding. She inherited Trent's blue eyes and Mara's dark hair, along with a stubborn independence that made both parents laugh even when exasperated. 2 years later came a son they named James Thomas, honoring both James Hayes and Mara's father. A second daughter, Catherine, completed their family 3 years after that. Trent proved to be a devoted father who approached parenting with the same thoughtful intensity he brought to everything. He taught all 3 children to ride and shoot and work the land, but also insisted they receive proper education. When Kingston finally built a schoolhouse, the Xavier children were among the first students enrolled. On quiet evenings, after the children were in bed and the day's work complete, Mara and Trent would sit on the porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains. Sometimes they talked, sharing thoughts about the children or plans for the ranch or memories from the past. Other times they simply sat in comfortable silence, his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest, content in the life they had built together. During one such evening, nearly 20 years after that desperate stand in the mountain pass, Trent suddenly said, "Do you ever think about that day, when we first met?" "All the time," Mara admitted. "How different everything would be if you had not climbed up to stand beside me. I think about how you held that pass alone with just one rifle," Trent replied. "Your courage that day changed my life completely. Gave me a reason to stop hunting shadows and start building something real." "We built it together," Mara corrected, lifting her head to look at him. "Everything good in my life started the moment you chose to stand beside me instead of riding past." Trent kissed her gently, a gesture that remained as meaningful after 20 years as it had been that first night on the porch. "Best decision I ever made. I love you, Mara Xavier." "I love you too," Mara whispered back, the words as true and powerful as the first time she had spoken them. Inside the house, they could hear their children's voices as Sarah Emily read a bedtime story to her younger siblings, her voice carrying through the open windows. The sound filled Mara with contentment so profound, it almost hurt. This life, this family, this love had all grown from one afternoon when 2 people chose courage over safety and found something neither had been actively seeking. The ranch continued thriving through the years, eventually becoming one of the most successful operations in the Kingston area. When Trent's back started giving him trouble in his 50s, James took over most of the physical labor while his father handled the business side. Sarah Emily married a doctor and moved to Carson City, though she visited often with her own growing family. Catherine became a teacher in the Kingston schoolhouse, passing on knowledge to a new generation. Mara and Trent lived to see their grandchildren grow, to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by family and friends who marveled at their enduring love. When Trent passed away peacefully at 78, Mara held his hand and whispered the same words she had said so many times before. "Thank you for climbing up to stand beside me." She followed him 18 months later, dying quietly in her sleep in the house her father had built. James Xavier inherited the ranch, maintaining it with the same dedication his parents had shown. The story of how his mother held a mountain pass alone with one rifle, and how his father climbed up to stand beside her became family legend, passed down through generations as proof that courage, love, and commitment could transform desperate circumstances into lasting happiness. In the Kingston Cemetery, two headstones stood side by side on a gentle hillside overlooking the town they had saved and the land they had loved. The inscriptions were simple. Mara Zimmerman Xavier, 1857–1935, and Trent Xavier, 1857–1933. But visitors who knew the story would stand there and remember the day two strangers became partners, how that partnership became love, and how that love created a legacy that endured long after both were gone. The mountain pass where it all began remained largely unchanged, rocky and difficult and commanding a view of the valley below. Occasionally, travelers would stop there and wonder about the old bullet scars still visible in the rocks, about the history those stones had witnessed. And if they asked in Kingston, old-timers would smile and begin the story of how she held the mountain pass alone with one rifle, and how the cowboy climbed up to stand beside her, and how from that desperate stand grew one of the greatest love stories the Nevada Territory had ever known.